Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey. Today we'll be discussing Game 68 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Washington Capitals and lost by a score of 5-1. So the Sharks go from playing against the second worst team in the NHL a couple of nights ago, the Chicago Blackhawks, to now playing against the second best team in the league, the Washington Capitals. And as has been the case for the entirety of this season and will continue to be the case for the rest of it, when the Sharks actually go up against the top teams like Washington or Toronto or Colorado or Florida, what they have to hope to accomplish is that they can catch the other team by surprise or asleep at the wheel, which will allow them to play a somewhat competitive 60 minutes and maybe even sneak out a victory here or there. Because if it actually ends up coming down to best on best, it is unsurprising that the last place team would actually lose, and lose handedly, to the best in the league that are gunning for a Stanley Cup this season, like Washington currently is. And so the problem coming into this one was twofold. First of all, in the last game that the Capitals played against the Los Angeles Kings just 2 nights ago, they got shut out. And for the team that leads the league in terms of goals scored this season, that is not a usual circumstance for them, and they'll want to come out with a vengeance here tonight. As well, this was the final game of their California road trip before they head home. They'll want to end it on a high note. On top of that, the Capitals aren't going to be taking the Sharks lightly either, because in their first and only other matchup this season, San Jose actually won 2-1 in overtime back in Washington. So this meant a decent bit to this Capitals team, who really showed it in this first period by absolutely crushing the San Jose Sharks' hopes and dreams in this first 20 minutes. They are by far the better team. It's not even remotely close, and they add not 1, not 2, but 3 goals for themselves to show for it. 1 from Strome, 1 from Protas, and 1 from Radish. It is 3-0 after 20 minutes. And what the Capitals showed off here is not only that they were the stronger team, not only were they the more skilled team or the team that has more depth, but they also know what it takes to win. They play on the edge, and I'm not even necessarily talking about physically, though a team that features Tom Wilson is obviously going to be renowned for playing on the edge from a physical standpoint, but also just being able to eke out every possible advantage that you can when it comes to just taking these type of subtle penalties that don't actually end up getting called, whether that be interference or hooking or slashing, or in the case of this second goal that they score here, when it comes to holding. So what ends up happening here on this Protas goal is that Tom Wilson is in the corner, Shakir Mukhamadullin comes to challenge him, ties him up in that area, but so does Tyler Toffoli. Now, this wasn't a good choice by Toffoli. He probably shouldn't double team Wilson at that point, but it's not the end of the world because he could be able to get back into the play. But what happens is that as he comes in and makes contact with Wilson, Wilson holds him up there. This is a penalty, but the referees, in a subtle sort of way, they don't end up calling this. And so what happens is that Mukhamadullin is tying up Wilson, who is tying up Toffoli. That leaves a 4-on-3 on the ice for Washington. They take advantage as Eller is able to take this to the net quite easily because of the lack of coverage now, and Protas eventually puts it in. This is the type of move, as kind of cheating as it might seem, this is the type of move that teams do to have success in the playoffs. I mean, just look at the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. They were the masters of these types of plays, and Washington doing that, it's something that's going to work out for them, and it is something that the San Jose Sharks, who are a younger team, where a lot of their younger guys don't really know what they can and can't get away with at the NHL level, it is going to be a lesson that gets learned simply with time. When it comes to this second period, the game slows down considerably from an offensive standpoint. Usually you see teams, when they get like a 5 or 6 goal lead, they'll slow it down kind of out of like respect, but also just we don't really need to try as hard. But the Capitals end up doing that up 3 goals. It shows a tremendous amount of confidence and maybe also a little bit of arrogance that they believe that they can turtle for the final 40 minutes of this game and the Sharks won't be able to close a 3-goal gap. And well, they are proven correct, at least in the second period, as while the Capitals don't do much, neither do the Sharks. But this was not a boring 20 minutes either. as we did see some sort of physical altercations occur here, including a couple of fights. So the newest San Jose Sharks getting into it, Zach Ostapchuk challenges Tom Wilson, which is not necessarily something most people are willing to do, as Wilson is known as one of the best fighters and physical type of players in the entire league, and Ostapchuk gets absolutely destroyed. And then soon after, it is Noah Gregor, who is the newest, oldest Shark on this team. He also gets into a fight, and then we also then see later on a bit, Jacob Chikrin cross-check an unsuspecting Vincent DeHarnay in the hip. This was a very dirty play. Could have definitely been a major penalty, but there were a lot of scrums here over the last few minutes of this second period. The referees needed to try and take back control, and to their credit, they managed to do so, as the game definitely cooled down in the third, where we see Celebrini finally break the shutout. This gets the Sharks to within 2, and maybe some sparks of life, until just less than a minute later, Trevor Van Riemsdyk reasserts the Capitals' position in this game, restores the 3-goal lead, and eventually it is none other than Alex Ovechkin scoring his 887th career goal as he comes to within 7 of Gretzky, and that is a final score 5-1 for Washington. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli, and we'll start off here with Macklin Celebrini. A bit of a tale of two games for him, because this first period was not good in any stretch of the imagination, as this was kind of the case for much of the Sharks team, so it's not as though Celebrini is an isolated incident here in these first 20 minutes, but he had a lot of trouble actually making plays happen. It kind of reminded me of the game last week by William Eklund against the New York Islanders, where the effort level is there, as you would expect from Celebrini. He does not take a singular night off ever, but the execution was very off. It felt as though every pass that he would try to make would either be completely off the mark or would end up deflecting off of a Capitals player and not reaching its intended target still. So definitely a large struggle in those first 20 minutes as the Capitals kind of leaned off a little bit off the gas pedal. This gave more space on the ice, more of an ability for Celebrini to make things happen, and he actually ended up redeeming himself quite well in the final 40 minutes of this one. He also scores the Sharks' only goal, which helps him keep pace a little bit in the Calder race, his 50th point of the season to go along with his 21st goal, and generally he made some nice things happen in the third period. So all in all, certainly not the worst Shark on the ice, probably one of their better forwards, but that first period is a learning experience against a team that is significantly further ahead than him. When it comes to his two line mates, Tyler Toffoli and William Eklund, both I thought were also quite unremarkable in that first period. It was a little bit because I think Celebrini was trying to do too much and wasn't actually able to accomplish it, but still, I don't think either of these guys really shined all that much in that first. But as the game wore on, in particular, I thought Tyler Toffoli stepped up in a decent way. He looked quite good in those final couple of periods. Eklund, not as much. He was average-ish, not amazing, not terrible. Just a generally okay but not great game for this first line. Then we get to the Sharks' second line, and the first player who I do want to talk about is Will Smith. It's been a bit of a weird week for Smith. That game against the Nashville Predators, he had a primary assist on the Colin Graf goal, but that was actually one of his worst games that he has played over the last couple of months. Then he comes back against Chicago, and he picks up another couple of points, a pretty well-played game for him for sure. And then here tonight, it's interesting, because in the first period, I mentioned the Sharks, very few players actually got much of anything going, except for Smith, who found himself in multiple high danger areas to score. And the thing is, if this happens just once or twice throughout an entire game, you're thinking, oh, maybe it's just a little bit of a coincidence, he got a lucky bounce here or there. But if this happens, 4 times in just the first period and then another half dozen times in the rest of the game, that's not a coincidence, that's not luck. It is Smith who is reading the play so well in the offensive zone that he is putting himself in the correct positions for these pucks to come to him and for him to get these chances. He could have had a couple of goals against Logan Thompson here tonight, if not for some great goaltending coming from the Capitals goalie. So very happy with how Smith was able to find some room in a very tight checking, strong Washington Capitals game. It was very impressive to say the least. There were some mistakes being made here, some moments, especially in the third, in which he attempted to clear out of the zone and it didn't work out and it led to some extended pressure. These are the types of mistakes that are understandable, but on the offensive side of things, I thought Smith was one of the best players for the Sharks this game. When it comes to his line mate on the other side is winger Colin Graf. I also was appreciative of Graf's effort here tonight. He skated hard, he tried to be physical, he tried to retrieve pucks, he was good along the wall. Graf, I feel as though, continued to really make a strong statement here to try and remain in the Sharks' top six. This was not a Klim Kostin-esque game in which he just doesn't do much of anything, even though Graf does not get on the scoreboard in this game. This is the type of game that if I'm watching and I'm Ryan Warsofsky, I think I'm giving him another look in this top six because it did stand out in a positive light. When it comes to Alex Wennberg, I actually thought, interestingly enough, he may have been the weak link of this second line, not by a significant amount, but I really liked what I saw from Graf and Smith. Wennberg slightly less, but he was still pretty decent. Then we get to the Sharks' bottom six, and I want to take a moment to discuss something that I've mentioned multiple times already earlier this season, which is that these days in the NHL, you cannot simply just have a top six that is able to score points. You need to actually have expanded that to a top nine. You can't just roll two lines anymore. You have to have that depth. And so taking a look at the Washington Capitals, the second best team in the league coming into tonight, now tied for first place thanks to this victory, they have those top two lines with great scorers like Ovechkin and Dubois and Protas and McMichael, but you take a look at their third line as well. It was Mangiapane, Lars Eller, as well as Taylor Radish, who actually scored a goal here tonight. They had a combined 66 points heading into this game. This isn't spectacular, but it is pretty good, and it is the type of depth necessary to win in the playoffs. On the Sharks side of things, their third line has a combined 13 points throughout this entire season. That is less than 1/5 of the Washington side of things. And in fact, if you extend that to their entire bottom six, all six of these players, not one of them has even 10 points on the season this year. Now, this is a little unfair for a guy like Patrick Giles because he's only played, I think, a dozen games this season. But for guys like Goodrow, Dellandrea, and even in the case of former Ottawa Senators players like Ostapchuk and Gregor, who have played about half the season, it is still telling that these are not offensively gifted players within this Sharks roster. And this is the time of the year, the final 14 games, or I guess it was 15 coming in tonight, now the final 14 games, where you want to kind of figure out what you have, and it's quite clear that what the Sharks have in all six of these players, besides maybe Kostin, but even then, what you really have in these players is players who just are not going to make an impact offensively, and this hurts San Jose, where you see them in a game in which they're trailing 3 goals for as long as they were. You get your first line on the ice, and maybe some things happen thanks to Celebrini and Eklund, and you get your second line on the ice and Smith gets a good chance, but then when you put either both your third or fourth line, you're not getting much of anything doing. So teams you'll usually see late in the game, they'll kind of bench their fourth line a little bit and roll their top 3. The Sharks kind of have to bench their bottom 2 lines and just roll their top 2 if they want any sort of chance of coming back in these games. So I have constantly been talking about the Sharks calling up players from the San Jose Barracuda to try out certain different players in these areas to see what they have, can they make an impact, and I mean, come on. When the Sharks' second power play unit features Barclay Goodrow as it did here tonight, that should be like the red flag that a change needs to happen. So when it comes to these players on the individual standpoint on this third line, Giles, Gregor, Dellandrea, honestly, none of these bottom 6 players actually stood out in any sort of positive light throughout this game. It was the type of one in which they were just pretty much caved in their own zone by a superior Washington Capitals squad, which is both not a surprise but still slightly disappointing to see. We saw maybe one good chance from Patrick Giles. He was probably the most impressive player within the Sharks' entire bottom 6, which has kind of been the case for him in each of these last couple of games, so credit to him in that area. When it comes to his 2 line mates, Dellandrea still very unnoticeable. Noah Gregor, he gets into that fight. Otherwise, he kind of just gets beat in a situation in the defensive zone that leads to a goal against. Not really remarkable. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we can discuss Zach Ostapchuk. He makes his debut for the San Jose Sharks, and this is, of course, very important to mention that just because it is just a singular game, that doesn't mean that he's going to be a bust. He is 21 years old, and this was a very, very tough matchup against a really great team in Washington, so there's not any sort of real conclusions that you can draw from this. Having said that, however, you watch Ostapchuk here tonight, and you think about what Mike Greer said in his press release, and he goes, I see the real potential there, and he's going to become the next elite third-line center of the entire league. You don't really see that in this particular game. There wasn't anything remarkable at all about what Ostapchuk was able to do. He had one okay try give and go with Barclay Goodrow, which is a lesson he's learning early to not try and do that with Barclay Goodrow. And then, of course, he got into that fight where he got crushed by Tom Wilson. But otherwise, there wasn't really many positives. I'll be interested to see what he does into the future here for San Jose if he manages to maintain that lineup spot. I remember the kind of word coming out of Ottawa when the Sharks traded for him that last week was that he's someone who might need a little bit more time in the minors, so it's interesting that the Sharks are trying him out here in the first place. And then when it comes to the two other players here, Klim Kostin, besides blocking a shot, and that was a nice one to see, he didn't actually get much done. And then Barclay Goodrow, very much the same thing. This was a very, as I said, underwhelming performance for all 6 of these players, more or less. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. We have the Sharks' top pairing of Ferraro and Mukhamadullin. We're definitely out of their element in this particular game. The Capitals were pushing, and this group was definitely bending. In the case of Mario Ferraro, some mistakes for sure being made. The first one coming on that Dylan Strome goal that made that 1-0. This is way too high up of a neutral zone pinch. You have Macklin Celebrini closing in there. You need to hang back for Dylan Strome, who's clearly moving up the middle, and allow your forwards to make the play. Him pinching up, yes, if he gets the puck, it's good, but he doesn't, and that allows for this 2-on-1 and eventual kind of breakaway style of goal because Mukhamadullin commits to trying to get the puck away from Ovechkin. So not a great move from Ferraro. There were other giveaways here tonight. Pretty standout poor game from him. When it comes to Shakir Mukhamadullin, the defensive side of things, there were some issues for him. I actually thought he defended okay in his own zone, but definitely in which moments that he probably would have liked back. However, in the positive side of things, at the very least, we did see some offensive flair from him in the third period, moments of keeping the puck alive at the blue line, skating it down himself, trying to get involved. We saw him get a very good chance as well from a Macklin Celebrini early in the third period on the backhand that was saved by Logan Thompson, so I like to see that type of progress that Mukhamadullin was made, but it is still indeed something that he's going to work on when it comes to his own zone, trying to improve defensively when it comes up against these best of the best teams, just as he struggled the other night against Colorado. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Vlasic and Liljegren. Not a great night for either of these two players. Vlasic makes the mistake, or a couple of mistakes even, on the Ovechkin goal, giving that one away and then not being able to tie up Ovechkin. To be fair, he is not the first defenseman who has not been able to tie up Ovechkin. As I mentioned, he is the almost new leading goal scorer in NHL history, so you can't really fault 38-year-old Vlasic in that particular spot, but still not the greatest shift for him and generally not the greatest game for him. And then when it comes to Timothy Liljegren, outside of taking yet another interference penalty, though a bit of a weaker call, he as well kind of struggled from a defensive standpoint and didn't really provide much offensively outside of a couple of moments. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, however, we will start off with Vincent Desharnais, and I've been harping on this in each of the last few games since the Sharks acquired him at the deadline, which is that we needed to see a true test for Desharnais. Games against the Islanders, the Predators, the Blackhawks, 3 of the worst teams in the NHL, it's easier to defend against those clubs, but a game against Washington, the highest scoring team in the league, how is he going to look in that area? And surprisingly, he was actually rather solid. I appreciated the type of effort that Desharnais brought, and you could very well say, honestly, I don't even think it's that controversial, that he was the Sharks' best defenseman here tonight. He continues to be so smart, so well positioned in the defensive zone. He blocks shots, he fights for pucks, he wins battles, and while he's not the fastest player, and this much is going to remain the case for the rest of his career, he is still doing so much good for this team. And I remembered when he was acquired, the word was, and I said it myself, that he was just going to be a replacement for Jan Rutta, and it was beginning to look that he might actually be an upgrade over Jan Rutta, but at this point, I'm starting to think this is an entirely new model of Jan Rutta. You have upgraded in every possible area. Vincent Desharnais actually looks like an extremely solid defenseman. Not necessarily top pairing, but very good to be playing in a bottom pairing role, or even maybe a second pairing role, considering he did have 20 minutes here tonight. The only reason he's really considered the bottom pairing is because of his defensive partner, Jimmy Schultz. who I will get to now, Jimmy Schultz, I also was pleasantly surprised by. Now, he was sheltered significantly more than Desharnais, so not going to sing his praises as much, but Schultz actually had some decent moments. He was physical, he was aggressive, he stepped up a couple of times that actually worked out, and so again, not while he didn't have the toughest of minutes in this particular game, I thought he showed some good things when he was on the ice. Having said that, I've also been championing the call-up of Luca Cagnoni from the San Jose Barracuda, and I will continue to do so. I would much rather see him be given an opportunity, not even necessarily for the rest of this season, but at least a couple of games, instead of someone like Schultz, who, while he has been solid, he's also a 29, almost 30-year-old defenseman who probably won't even be playing for the Sharks as soon as next season. So how much do you really need to see out of him? Not really all that. Then when it comes to the Sharks goaltenders, we have Georgiev, who does get yet another start here tonight. Really, Ryan Warsofsky is dedicated to trying to run him into the ground. I can understand it, I guess, because the Sharks do have multiple days off after this one, but still, it does seem to backfire a little bit, as this first period, while I don't think Georgiev is entirely at fault, as I mentioned, the Capitals just ran over San Jose, he didn't help them a ton either. This Strome goal, it's a one-on-one, maybe not too much blame, and then the Protas goal is also a situation where there's just too much room for the Capitals in front of the net. The Radish goal, however, while he does have the time to pick a spot, this isn't necessarily the best of the best shooter in the NHL. I think Georgiev should have much more of a chance on this one, but in the end, he does let in 3 goals in the first, and that does it for his night, and that steps in Georgi Romanov. Now, Romanov, this is his third bit of NHL action, and yet he has still never actually started a game in the league. All 3 of his times he's got in between the pipes has been in relief of a different Sharks goaltender. He was, solid-ish throughout this game. In the second period, he doesn't let in any goals, but as is usually the case for a player coming in relief, it's a situation where Washington is not pushing nearly as much, and so Romanov is not tasked with making the saves that Georgiev was. When it did come down to it, however, and Celebrini scored and made this 3-1, and Washington kind of had to wake up a little bit. Pretty much the first play that occurs is this Trevor Van Riemsdyk goal, his first of the season, in which Romanov makes a pretty big mistake. As Van Riemsdyk is moving behind the net, Romanov is going to try to make the push across to defend, let's say, a potential wraparound goal, but he does this too early. He is too anxious to make this play. Van Riemsdyk, who, as I mentioned, his first goal of the season, this is not a goal scorer, he still is able to recognize this, goes for the bank play by shooting it off the back of the goaltender, and it just barely squeaks in. So a rookie mistake here from Romanov, that makes it 4-1, and then this goal from Ovechkin, as I've already mentioned multiple times, the soon-to-be best goal scorer in the entire history of the league, and this is a great between-the-legs tip. Don't blame him for letting in that one. So not the greatest night for Romanov. He looked shaky-ish, maybe a little nervous at times, but can't be too upset with him. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, so they will have multiple days off here before their next game. That will be against the Carolina Hurricanes. This is finally the kind of karma for the Sharks, having been the team with the most played games for so long through November, December, January. They're finally getting some breaks in their schedule. And what's most interesting about this is that the Sharks were at home here tonight, or today, against Washington. They will also be at home in that game against Carolina. So they not only have 4 days off, it is 4 days off in San Jose. That is very nice for the players, and hopefully they can come back looking a little bit better than they did here tonight. Class dismissed.